The letter came on a Tuesday in October, and I remember the day exactly because the harness on the bay mare had given out that morning, and I'd spent 2 hours in the cold barn trying to salvage a piece of leather that turned out to be beyond salvage. I came inside and sat at the table with the mess of it spread out in front of me and the lamp going, and Amos Kettrick knocked on the door with the post. He set the letter on the table. He didn't say anything. He knew what it was. The whole county knew what it was, more or less. I'd been writing to a widow named Clara Prentice in Ohio for 5 months. We'd settled on terms. She was supposed to arrive on the Friday stage with her younger sister, who was coming west to live with us until she found her own situation or decided to go back east. That was the arrangement. It had taken 3 letters each direction, 1 small photograph, and a great deal of careful language about what a man in my position could provide and what he could not. I'd been precise about all of it. I read the letter twice. Clara wasn't coming. She'd married a druggist in Columbus in September. She was sorry. The letter had been sitting at the Kansas City post office for 6 weeks because the address had been copied wrong from one of my envelopes. She didn't know if I'd received it. She hoped I'd understand. She wished me well. She hoped I wouldn't be too put out. I set the letter on the table. I looked at the ruined harness. I went out and hitched the mare with a spare I had from an older rig that didn't fit her right, and I drove into Casper and bought a new harness, and I came home, and I put the letter in the stove. What I did not know, what nobody in Harlow County knew, was that Nora Prentice had already left Ohio 6 days before that letter arrived. Let me tell you where I was in my life. I was 53 years old. I'd put in 17 years with the 6th Cavalry, Arizona Territory first, then Wyoming, a year in the sand hills of Nebraska where the wind off the plains didn't stop blowing from October until sometime in April. I knew what hard winters were. I knew what the frontier looked like when you stopped seeing it as temporary and started seeing it as the place you decided to live. I had a ranch outside Casper, 140 acres of decent grass with a creek that ran clear 10 months out of 12. I'd been building the herd for 8 years, careful and slow, never more than I could manage well, which is the only way to build a herd if you want it to hold. I had a good horse and a bad knee and a cough that came in October and left somewhere around March or April, depending on the year. I did not have a wife. I'd never had a wife. The cavalry doesn't make it easy. You're moving when they need you to move, stationed where they post you, gone for weeks at a time into country that no sensible woman wants to follow a man into. I'd spent my 30s and most of my 40s with the idea that I'd missed my moment, that particular door had swung shut while I was looking the other direction. The ranch changed my thinking some. A piece of land does something to a man standing, gives him a thing to offer beyond what he is himself. I was not a young man, and I knew it. I knew what I looked like, weathered past my years, quiet in a way some people read as coldness, not the kind of man who fills up a room when he walks into it. But I had the ranch and the herd, and I thought, write it all down plainly and see if there's a woman somewhere who thinks it's enough. Clara Prentice had seemed to think it was enough. And then the druggist in Columbus had apparently been enough more. I didn't blame her. Not even a little. I thought about it one evening and I came to the conclusion that a woman in Ohio making a choice between a druggist she already knew and a man she'd never met, 53 years old, on a ranch in Wyoming she'd never seen, the math of that was not complicated. I had laid everything out plainly and she had read it plainly and she had made a plain decision. I respected it. I went to bed. Friday came. I drove into Casper because I am not a man who sends someone else to do his business, and because I thought there might be luggage on the stage that needed collecting, or some logistical loose end from Clara's side that needed tying off. I had a letter to post as well, to some relatives of Clara's in Ohio who'd been involved in the correspondence, just to acknowledge receipt. I went to manage what needed managing. The stage came in at 2 in the afternoon. 3 passengers, a traveling salesman with a heavy sample case that the driver handed down to him with some irritation, an older woman going to visit her daughter's family, and a young woman, not a girl. She was well past that, maybe 25 or 26, who stepped off last and stood in the dust of the Casper Street and looked at the town with the expression of a person who has committed fully to a thing and is only now beginning to understand, in physical and specific terms, what the thing actually consists of. She had on boots that were too big for her. I noticed that first, before I noticed her face or anything else. The way she came down the stage steps, careful and a little compensated, the gait of someone who's packed the toes of her boots with cloth or rags and is working around it. They were a woman's boots, quality leather, but sized for a foot with more length to it. She had a coat that fit her fine and a hat pinned straight and 2 bags she'd brought down herself from the stage roof, and a trunk that the driver set down in the street with a thump. She stood with her hand on the trunk and took stock of the town, the post office, the saloon with the sign that needed repainting, the dry goods, the livery, the small white church at the end of the street. I watched her look at all of it. Something in her jaw settled, like a decision being confirmed rather than made. She looked up and found me looking at her. "Are you Aldous Webb?" she said. Her voice was clear and level, Midwestern, no theater in it. I said I was. "I'm Nora Prentice," she said, "Clara's younger sister. I have a letter of introduction." She produced it from her coat pocket. "I'd like to speak with you if you have a few minutes." I said I had a few minutes. We stood in the street and she told me what had happened. She laid it out simply and without any apparent embarrassment, like she was reporting facts to someone who'd need them to make a decision, which, I supposed, was exactly what she was doing. Clara had been engaged to the druggist before the correspondence with me had started. She'd broken the engagement in the spring, had second thoughts in August, had reconnected with him in September. Nora had been the one who'd found my advertisement in the Ohio paper to begin with, had shown it to Clara, had thought it was a real opportunity. When Clara had written to call it off, Nora had already given notice at her job at a millinery shop in Columbus, had arranged for her trunk to be packed, had purchased her stage ticket. "Why?" I said. She looked at me like the question was simpler than I was making it. "Because Clara didn't need to come anymore," she said. "She had her situation, I don't have one." I said, "What did you expect to do exactly?" "Come and keep the arrangement," she said, "if you're willing." I looked at her, she looked at me. The October sun was at that late angle where it lights things from below, which is a strange and particular light, and I associate it with the frontier, because the sky is wide enough out here that the light does things it doesn't do back east. "We've never corresponded," I said. "You know nothing about me except what your sister told you." "I know what your letters said," she said. "Clara showed me the first one. She read it aloud to me." "That's not the same as knowing me." "No," she said, "but Clara and you didn't know each other either. That was the arrangement." I could not argue with that. That was exactly what the arrangement had been. "Give me a day," I said. "That's reasonable," she said. She glanced at the hotel across the street. "I'll get a room. Come find me when you've thought it through." I drove back to the ranch without her. I want to try to explain the state I was in on that drive, because it matters to what I decided and why, and because if I don't explain it, you might think I was more collected about it than I actually was. I was not collected. I was 53 years old, and I had spent 5 months arranging something that had just been untethered from its anchor. And now, an entirely different woman was standing in Casper in borrowed boots offering to take the place of the first one. And I needed to understand what I actually thought about that. The practical reasoning was not hard to follow. The arrangement had been built around what I could provide and what a woman's presence would add to the place, and none of that had changed. She was unmarried, she needed a situation, I had a situation available. That much was clear. But here is the thing I kept coming back to on the drive home, the thing I couldn't put down. She was young, 25, 26. She had a face that had not been shaped by copying any other face I knew. There was something particular about it, an original, dark eyes. She looked at you directly without moving off it, which most people can't do for long, and she seemed to do without effort. She'd stepped off a stage in a town she'd never been to and introduced herself to a stranger, and laid out her situation plainly and without embarrassment, and there had not been a moment of performance in any of it. I had been thinking of the arrangement with Clara as a practical matter, two people of compatible expectations entering into a workable situation. I'd been honest with myself about that. I was not a romantic man, had never been, did not trust the word in the way some people use it. I wanted a good life, and I wanted someone to share it with, and I wanted to do right by whoever that was. That was what I'd laid out in those letters, and I'd meant every word. Nora Prentice did not feel like a practical matter. She felt like something that could go wrong, badly and irreversibly, if I wasn't careful. And because I am the kind of man who has spent a long time being careful, I drove home and I sat on the porch until the cold drove me inside, and I sat at the table until after midnight, and I tried to think through every version of what said yes, and what saying no, and what each of them would look like in a year, and in 5 years, and in 10. I kept landing in the same place, not because of any logic I could have defended out loud, but because I could not stop thinking about the way she'd looked at the street when she got off the stage, and the way her jaw had settled, and the boots. I went back to town the next morning. She was in the hotel dining room. She had a book open beside her breakfast plate and she was reading, not watching the door. She looked up when I sat down across from her, registered that I was there, and finished the paragraph she was on before she set the book down. I noticed that. It told me something about her. "Well," she said. "I want to be straight with you," I said. "I don't know if this is a good idea." "Neither do I," she said. "What are your concerns?" Nobody had ever asked me that before, not like that, and I have spent a fair amount of my life in conversations where concerns were either being registered or overridden, but rarely invited directly. I looked at her. "You're considerably younger than me," I said. "The work on the ranch is harder than you've probably imagined. Wyoming winters are not like Ohio winters. I am a quiet man, and I know that some people read that as coldness or as absence, and I can't promise I'll change at this stage." She listened. She didn't nod through it like a person waiting for their turn. "How old are you?" she said. I told her 53. She thought about that. "Clara didn't mention your age specifically." I was explicit in the letters. Clara is not a precise reader. She picked up her coffee cup. "What else?" I said, "I want to know why you did this. The real reason, not the practical one." She set the cup down. "Clara showed me your first letter," she said. "She came home from the post office in June, and she sat down at the kitchen table and read it out loud to me. The whole thing. And when she finished, I thought, that is a good man. That is a serious man writing seriously about a serious thing, not pretending to be more than he is and not pretending to be less. Whoever goes out there is going to have a real life." She paused, looking down at the book cover. "Then in September, Clara went back to the druggist, and I thought, well, somebody ought to go." I said, "That's still the practical reason." She looked up at me. "Aldous," she said, and it was the first time she'd used my name, and she said it flat and level, like she'd been saying it for some time and hadn't just learned it yesterday. "I am 26 years old. I worked in a hat shop for 4 years sewing trim and pricing ribbon and listening to women talk about their daughters' weddings. I am sitting in Wyoming by myself with a trunk full of winter clothes. I came out here on the strength of a letter my sister read to me." She held my eyes. "Give me credit for knowing what I was doing." I didn't say anything. "I thought," she said, "if he writes like that, I want to know the man who writes like that." The dining room was not quiet exactly. There were other people in it, the usual morning sounds, but it felt quiet to me. I sat across from this woman I'd known for about 18 hours, and I thought about the letter she was talking about, which I'd written at this same table in June and spent 3 evenings on, choosing every word, trying to be accurate, not knowing if accurate was what a woman wanted to read or if I should be something other than accurate. And she had heard it read aloud in a kitchen in Columbus, and it had made her get on a stage. "All right," I said. She looked at me. "I'll need your help with the cattle through the winter," I said. "Not because I can't manage them myself, but because it's a 2-person operation and the winter is when it counts. I want to know if you're capable of hard physical work in cold weather." "I grew up on a farm," she said. "In Ohio, we had cattle." "Ohio winters." "I'm not complaining about Ohio winters," she said. "I'm saying I know what cows need." I nodded. "The house needs work. You'd have the back room. There's no one else on the property." "I know that." "Then we understand each other." "I think so," she said. I stood up. "Stage comes back through in an hour. If you want to change your mind, now is the time." She looked at me. "I bought a one-way ticket, Aldous." She moved into the ranch house on a Saturday, and I want to tell you what the next months were like, because they were unlike anything I had expected, and the things that surprised me were not the things I'd been preparing for. I'd been prepared for friction. 2 strangers in a small house, a lot of silence, the learning of habits and tolerances. I'd been prepared for some difficulty with the work. She'd said she'd grown up on a farm, but farm work in Ohio was not the same as ranch work in Wyoming, and I knew that. I'd been prepared for her to want things I couldn't give her, company or comfort or warmth that I didn't know how to provide. I'd been thinking about all the ways it could go wrong. What I had not been prepared for was how quickly the house became a place that functioned. She didn't transform it. She didn't fuss at it. She found out where things were, and she learned the rhythms of the mornings, what needed doing in what order, which of the horses needed extra attention in the cold, when the stove burned hot, and when it wanted to bank low, and she incorporated that knowledge into what she did, and then she just did it. By the end of the 2nd week, the kitchen had a logic to it that I couldn't have articulated, but that I noticed immediately when she set it up that way, because suddenly I could find everything I needed in the time it actually took to find it, rather than the extra 10 minutes I'd apparently been spending every morning without knowing it. There was a smell to the floors that I couldn't identify, something she'd used to clean them, and it was a good smell, a smell that meant the place was being looked after. I noticed these things. I didn't say so. The cattle were a revelation to her, not a bad revelation, but a real one. She had grown up around cows, and she said so, and she wasn't lying. But Ohio dairy cattle and Wyoming range cattle are different animals with different temperaments and different requirements, and she spent the first 2 weeks learning that. I watched her figure it out. I watched her get crowded once at the fence and step back and think about it, and the next morning she went in differently and she didn't get crowded again. She didn't ask me how to do it. She worked it out herself, which told me something. There was a horse named Cutter that I kept for work, a big gray gelding with strong opinions, and a habit of testing new people by standing on their foot if they let him. He stood on her foot the 3rd morning she was there. She said a word I had not expected her to know, removed her foot, and said something quiet in his ear that I couldn't hear from where I was standing, and after that Cutter and Nora appeared to have reached an understanding of some kind, because he didn't do it again. I asked her once what she'd said to him. She said she'd told him the arrangement. I didn't ask what that meant. I had the feeling I knew. What she did with her evenings surprised me more. She didn't talk much in the evenings, which I'd half expected and half not. But she also didn't expect me to talk. She had her book. She had mending she'd taken on from some of the women in town, a little money to put aside, which she'd arranged without asking me whether she could, because it was her time to do with as she chose. Sometimes she wrote letters back to Ohio. Sometimes she sat at the table with paper and did what looked like arithmetic, though she closed it up when I came near and I didn't ask. The evenings had a quality of two people occupying the same room without requiring anything from each other, and I had not realized until it was there that that was exactly what I'd wanted without knowing how to ask for it. She asked questions when she needed information and not otherwise. She had opinions, and she expressed them plainly when the matter was relevant to something we were doing, and she didn't express them when it wasn't. She did not appear to need reassurance. I found this restful in a way I would have found very difficult to explain to anyone who asked. In November, the cold came down hard and stayed. The first real Wyoming cold, not the October suggestion of it, but the actual article temperature that found the gaps in your coat and made your eyes water in the open air, and turned the water in the trough to solid ice every night that had to be broken out before the horses could drink. I watched to see how she handled it. She put on more clothes, and she got up earlier, and she worked harder, and she did not say anything about the cold, not a single complaint, not even the kind of casual mention that isn't quite a complaint but is doing the same work. There was a morning in early November when I came out to the barn before first light and found she'd been there before me. She'd broken the ice in both troughs and fed the horses their morning ration, and was working at a latch on one of the stall doors that had been freezing overnight and sticking, prying at it with a piece of iron bar. She looked up when I came in. "Third morning this has frozen," she said. "The pin is corroded, needs replacing." I got the right pin from the tack room and replaced it while she held the lantern. We didn't talk while we did it. When it was done, she tested the latch twice, nodded, and went back to the house to start breakfast. I stood in the barn for a moment after she left. I'd had a hired man for 2 seasons who'd worked the winter with me and never once noticed that latch. She wore those boots every day. Clara's boots, 2 sizes too big, packed at the toes. I saw her working in them, and I thought about it, and in December I drove her into town and stood outside the cobbler's shop while she got measured for a pair of her own. When she came out, she looked at me, and I could see her calculating whether to say something about it. "Thank you," she said. "A person needs boots that fit," I said. She looked down the street. I could see that she was working to keep the corner of her mouth where it was. "Yes," she said, "they do." Garrett Dowd came around for the first time in November. He was a rancher about 4 miles north of my property, a few years younger than me, well fixed in the county, a widower with 2 grown sons who worked the ranch with him. He was a respected man, a man I knew and dealt with and had no quarrel with. He came over ostensibly about a fence line issue that we'd been meaning to discuss since the previous spring and that we resolved in about 10 minutes, and then he stayed for coffee, and he was watching Nora. Not rudely, not in a way that you could call him out for. He was simply paying the kind of attention to her that a man pays when he's doing an assessment and has not decided yet what the results mean. He spoke to her directly and with courtesy, asked her about Ohio, asked how she was finding the winter. She answered him pleasant and brief, not warm but not unfriendly, and when he left she came and stood beside me on the porch and we watched his horse go down the road. "He'll come back," she said. I knew it too, probably. Neither of us said anything else. We went inside. He came back in December. He came back in January. Each time there was a reason, a reasonable, legitimate reason that any neighbor might have, and each time the reason took about 10 minutes to address and then he stayed a while. He was not a fool and he was not a bad man. He was a man who was looking at a young woman who was living in what appeared to be, from the outside, a provisional arrangement with an older man, and he was wondering if the arrangement might become less provisional if he presented an alternative. I understood the logic. I might have done the same in his position. What I did not know, what I could not know, was what Nora thought about it. She was pleasant to him. She was pleasant to everyone. But she did not seek him out, and she did not linger in the conversations with him, and when he left, she went back to what she'd been doing. I watched this. I told myself I wasn't watching it. There was a Saturday in January when Dowd came by, and I was in the barn with a horse that had thrown a shoe and was not being cooperative about having the situation corrected. A horse that's thrown a shoe is uncomfortable and knows it and blames you for the situation, which is the kind of logic that only makes sense if you're a horse. I had my back to the barn door and I heard Nora answer his knock at the house, and I heard the low exchange of voices, and then the house door, and I went back to the horse. By the time I came in, boots and coat and the particular cold smell of the barn still on me, Dowd was at the table with a cup of coffee that Nora had poured for him, and Nora was across from him with her mending in her lap, and they were talking about something. I came in at the middle of something about the price of hay this season, and whether the freight rates were going to hold through spring. Ranch talk, neighbor talk, the kind of conversation two people have when they are filling time around a different subject. Dowd saw me come in. Something shifted in him, not guilt, not alarm, nothing of that. He was not a man who'd done anything wrong and he didn't carry himself like one, but something recalibrated. He finished the thought he was on, drank his coffee, and made his departure in about the time it takes a man to acknowledge that the conversation he came for is not the one that's going to happen. Nora walked him to the door. I stood by the stove. When she came back and she picked up her mending and sat down again, she didn't say anything about him, and neither did I. The fire ticked. Outside, the wind had come up the way it did in January, not violent but steady, the kind of wind that tells you it intends to stay. I wanted to say something. I spent an hour deciding what to say, and by the time I'd worked it out, we were at supper. And at supper there was a different quality to the silence than usual, a quality I couldn't name, but that I was aware of the way you're aware of a change in air pressure before a storm. And then supper was over and the moment was gone, and I went to bed having said nothing. That night I lay awake a long time. I lay there and thought about the January cold and the stalled horse and the coffee cup on the table and the way Nora had looked up from her mending when I came in from the barn. That look. I kept coming back to that look. She had not looked relieved, she had looked settled. Like a person who had been waiting to see how something turned out and had now seen how it turned out and was confirming what they already knew. I am not a man who is easily surprised, as I have said. I had spent 17 years in the cavalry, where a man learns to read the thing before the thing, to know what's coming from the way people are moving rather than from what they say. I was good at reading situations. I read situations for a living for 17 years, and I had never been wrong in a way that cost lives. I had completely failed to read this one. I had been watching Dowd, and I had been watching Nora watch Dowd, and I had told myself I was watching to understand her options, which was the polite way I was framing it to myself. What I had actually been doing was watching to see if she was interested in him, and I had been afraid of the answer. I was not afraid of the answer now. The look she'd had when I came in from the barn was not a look I needed to interpret. It was a look that required no interpretation. It was the look of a woman who had already settled the question and was watching the question confirm itself. I lay there in the January dark, and I thought, she has been waiting for me to understand this for a while now. I didn't know what to do with that. I knew what I wanted to do with it. I knew that as clearly as I'd known anything in a long time. The question was whether I had any right to it, whether a man in my position, at my age, with the particular history of having come to this moment sideways through someone else's broken arrangement, whether that man had standing to ask for what he actually wanted. I thought about that for a long time. I decided I was going to ask anyway. February was bad that year. 3 days of hard wind starting on a Wednesday, the kind of wind that comes off the mountains and comes to stay, not blowing through but settling in. And by the time it let up on Friday evening, we had 8 inches of new snow on top of the old pack, and a temperature that made going outside feel like a conversation with something that wanted you to stop. 2 of the younger cattle had gotten pushed against the north fence in the blow and were half buried and frightened, and needed getting out. Saturday morning, I went out early with the shovel. There is work you can do with someone else and work you do alone because the other person doesn't need to be in it. And I had decided this was the second kind, because Nora had been fighting a cough all week, not a serious cough, but the kind that settles in and doesn't want to leave. And I know what Wyoming cold does to a cough that isn't quite gone. She came out about an hour after me. She came up beside me at the fence without saying anything, and took the second shovel that I'd brought without thinking because you bring what you'll need and I'd brought two, and she started digging. "Go back inside," I said. "You've been coughing." "I'm fine," she said. "You are not fine. You've been coughing for 5 days. Are you going to stand there arguing with me," she said, "or dig?" We dug. The cattle were stupid about it the way frightened cattle always are. They want out but they flinch from the digging. They move when you need them still and go still when you need them to move. It took most of the morning. By the time we had them out and headed toward the shelter shed, Nora was shaking with cold, and her nose was red, and her breath was coming shallow because of the cough, and she was still not saying anything about any of it. I took her by the arm. It was the first time I'd touched her in the 4 months she'd been on the ranch, and I noted that distantly and filed it, and I walked her back to the house and sat her in the chair by the stove and went to heat water. While I waited, I looked at her from across the room. She had snow melting out of her hair, and her color was wrong from the cold, and she looked completely unlike anything I had arranged for or planned for, and she was looking at the stove with an expression I could not read. I brought her the tea. She took it in both hands. "You didn't have to come out," I said. "I know," she said. "Why did you?" She looked up at me. The fire was going well behind her, and the light from it moved on her face. "Because it's my ranch too," she said. I heard that. I sat down at the table and I heard that, and I did not say anything. She went on looking at the fire. She drank the tea. Outside, the snow sat quiet and enormous on everything, and the weight of it was a particular silence, the silence a heavy snowfall makes that isn't quite like any other silence. The cough came back and she worked through it, and then it settled again. "Go to bed," I said eventually. She went. I sat at that table alone for a long time. My ranch too. I hadn't asked her to think of it that way. I hadn't encouraged it. I'd been so careful about what I offered and what I couldn't offer, so careful about not wanting more than was practical, that I hadn't let myself look at what was actually happening in the house, in the months, in the mornings, in the way she moved through this place like she intended to be here for the rest of her life. She had, that was the thing. She had been here like she intended it from the first Saturday she moved in. She hadn't been cautious or provisional or waiting to see. She'd stepped off a stage in October in her sister's boots, and she'd come to my ranch, and she'd decided it was hers, and she'd spent a Wyoming winter making that true, and I had been so busy being careful that I had not understood it. I sat there until the fire burned low, and then I built it back up, and I sat there some more. The question was not whether I wanted this. I knew the answer to that. The question was whether I had any right to it, whether a man of 53, who had waited too long and not planned well enough and arrived at this moment largely because a druggist in Columbus had made a different woman a better offer, whether that man had any right to what was sitting across the table from him every morning. I thought about that for a long time. I decided that the answer was not my call to make. It was hers. All I could do was ask. I went to see Reverend Hadley in the last week of February. He came through Casper every 6 weeks on the circuit, an old man by then with a face like weathered wood, and a way of listening that made you feel like what you said was worth the air it took to say it. He'd known me since I'd come to the county. He was the kind of man who had seen most of what men do when they're trying to figure out their lives, and he had a way of hearing the question inside the question, which I needed. I sat across from him in the back room of the church, which smelled like candle tallow and cold air and old wood, and I said, "I need to ask a woman to marry me, and I don't know how to do it." He looked at me for a moment. How long have you known her? 4 months. She came as part of an arrangement that fell through. She came anyway. In what sense is she part of an arrangement that fell through? I told him the whole of it. The advertisement, the letters, Clara, the Columbus druggist, the stage, the boots, the winter, the fence in February. He listened without interrupting, which is a rarer quality than people think. He didn't write anything down. He just listened with that face of his and let me get through it. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "What does she want?" I said, "The ranch, the life. She's already decided all of that. What I'm trying to figure out is how to tell her that I've decided it too." "And what have you decided?" I thought about the February snow and the tea and the firelight and the sound of the gate chain tapping against the post outside, which I had listened to for 8 years without it meaning anything in particular. I said, "for her to have it." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Aldous, that is either the most honest thing I've ever heard a man say about a woman, or you're a bigger fool than I've always taken you for, possibly both." I said, "That's not helpful." "What she wants to hear," he said, "is not that you want to provide for her. She can see you doing that already. What she wants to hear is that you see her." He folded his hands on the table. "Tell her what you actually see when you look at her, not the arrangement, her." I said, "I'm not good at that." "No," he said, "you're not, but try anyway." I drove home that evening thinking about what he'd said, about seeing her. I had been seeing her, that was the truth of it. I had been seeing her since October, whether I admitted it or not. And the winter had been one long, careful accumulation of things I'd seen and filed away and told myself were practical observations, and not what they actually were. What they actually were was the beginning of a life I hadn't known how to ask for. I waited until March. I waited not because I was building up to it or because I had some idea of the right moment, but because March took its time arriving, and when it did, it arrived with a kind of morning that the previous 5 months had not had, clear, cold, but with real light in it, the particular quality of light that comes when the days are finally winning back their length, and the sky has turned a color deeper than the winter sky. That morning the cattle were settled. The creek was showing at the edges where the ice was giving up, and when I came in for coffee, I found Nora at the table with the barn jacket she'd been mending, and the east window was throwing its best light across the table, and I sat down. "I want to talk about the arrangement," I said. She set the jacket down. She looked at me. "When you came here," I said, "you stepped into something that was meant for your sister. I know that, you know that. We've both known that since you stepped off the stage. And for the first while I kept thinking about it in those terms, the arrangement, the situation, what made practical sense. That's how I think. I'm a careful man. I arrange things in my head before I do them." She was very still. "What I've been trying to tell you," I said, "for about 3 weeks now is that I stopped thinking in those terms a while back. I stopped some time around February." I looked at my coffee cup, then back at her. "The morning after the fence, when I sat at this table by myself." She said nothing. "I'm not good at this," I said. "You should know that going in. I won't get better at it. What I can tell you is this. I know that you rode 4 months of a Wyoming winter in boots that didn't fit you, in a house that wasn't yours, on a ranch you had no obligation to. I know that you came out when you didn't have to, and you helped with the cattle, and you told me it was your ranch too, and I didn't say anything, and I should have, but the truth is I needed some time to understand what you meant by it." She was very still. "I think you meant that you decided," I said. "I think you decided in October, maybe in Ohio even before that. And I've been standing outside the door of that decision for 4 months trying to decide if I was allowed to walk through it." She looked at me. "I want to ask you to marry me," I said, "not because the arrangement requires it. Because I would like it very much if you stayed, and I would like to try to be worth the boots." She stared at me. "Worth the boots," she repeated. I understand that's not the most. Aldous, she said. She said it the way she always said it, flat and direct, like my name was a fact she was stating. I wore those boots for 4 months, through a Wyoming winter, in a house that wasn't mine with a man who hadn't asked me to be there. She paused. I think I've been trying to make my answer clear. I sat with that. Is that a yes? I said. She looked at me like I had asked a simple question, and the answer was below the threshold of what required words. Yes, she said. Aldous, that's a yes. Garrett Dowd came one last time in April. He came on a morning I was in the barn, came to the house door and knocked, and Nora answered it. I don't know the whole of what was said. I was with a horse that needed its feet looked at, and I wasn't paying attention to the road. When I came around the corner of the barn, he was back on his horse, and she was standing in the yard and her arms were crossed, and there was something settled about the way she was standing, the particular stillness of a person who has said the last thing they're going to say about a subject. He tipped his hat to her, politely, genuinely. He looked at me, nodded, and turned his horse down the road and didn't look back. I walked over to where Nora was standing. Fence line, I said. Something like that, she said. I looked down the road. Dowd was already getting small in the distance. Then Nora put her hand through my arm, just that, just the flat of her hand inside my elbow, easy, like it was a thing she'd done 1,000 times, and we stood there together and watched him go. Neither of us said anything for a while. Then she said, "Are we going to stand here all day?" "No," I said. We went back to work. We married in May. Reverend Hadley came through on his regular circuit, and we did it in the morning, the three of us and Amos Kettrick, who served as witness and wore his Sunday hat and could not stop smiling in a way that I found both aggravating and, I will admit, agreeable. Nora made her own dress over the winter, gray, good material, and she wore flowers pinned at the collar that she'd gotten somewhere and that I didn't ask about. The ceremony was short and plain, and Hadley did not embellish it, which I appreciated. When he got to the part about taking and holding and being faithful, I looked at her, and she looked at me. There are times in a person's life when they see someone else's face very clearly, in the specific sense of seeing what is actually there, rather than what you expect to be there, or what you've arranged yourself to see. I had that experience twice with Nora, once in October when she stepped off the stage and looked at the street, and once standing in front of Reverend Hadley in May. What I saw in May was not softness. It was not the expression of a woman overcome by the occasion or moved by the ceremony. It was the same expression she'd worn in October, her jaw settled, the decision already made and confirmed, no uncertainty in it. She was saying words out loud that she had already determined to be true, and she was looking at me like she was saying them to me specifically, not to the room or the occasion. I looked back at her and I tried to let her see that I understood. What I was accepting, what she was giving, what it cost, and what it was worth. Hadley said what he needed to say, and we said what we needed to say. There are mornings in October now, and we are talking about 13 years on from that first October, when I go out on the porch before the sun is all the way up, when the air has the first real cold in it, and the grass is starting to go pale, and the hills to the west have turned that blue-gray that means the season has turned for real, and I stand there with my coffee, and I look at what I have. The herd is a better herd than I thought I'd manage. The pasture is good. The creek is clear. The knee is worse but manageable if I'm careful, which I am, because she makes me be. The cough still comes in October and leaves in spring, and she has something ready for it before I think to ask every year. I stand on that porch and I think about a Tuesday in October 13 years ago, a man at a table with a broken harness, and a letter from a woman who chose a druggist in Columbus. I think about the decision I almost made, which was to let the whole business of it go, to set the letter in the stove and go back to managing alone, which was what I knew and what I was good at. I think about a stage at 2 in the afternoon, and a woman stepping down from it in boots that didn't fit, setting her jaw and looking at a town she'd never seen. There is a smoke from the chimney behind me when I'm standing on that porch. She is up before me. She is always up before me. I used to try to beat her to it, and I gave that up somewhere around the second year because she sleeps lightly and a sound in the kitchen wakes her, and she gets up, and that is simply what happens. I stopped trying to prevent it. I started accepting it as one of the facts of the life, the way you accept the facts of the place, the cold, the short summers, the wind that comes in November and doesn't fully let up until April. There are a lot of facts like that now, after 13 years. I went looking for her once, went into the kitchen to see where she was, on one of those October mornings. I knew she was in there. I went because I wanted to see her. She had her back to the door, working at the counter, and she had her hair up the way she does when she intends to work, the practical way without frills to it, and she was talking to herself in the low, not quite audible way she does sometimes when she's thinking through something, running herself through a problem or a plan. She didn't hear me come in. I stood in the doorway. I looked at her. I want to be careful about how I describe this because it is easy to reach for the language of sentiment, and sentiment is not quite what I mean. What I mean is this. I stood in that doorway, and I had the distinct sensation of understanding my own life. Not every part of it, not the cavalry years or the lean years before the ranch got right or the long winter I went through when I was 42 and thought I was on the wrong side of all my choices. Those I still carry the way you carry the weight of the years. But the life that was there in front of me, in that kitchen on that morning, I understood it. I could see the shape of it. I could see that it was good. She heard me eventually. She turned. "How long have you been standing there?" she said. "Not long," I said. She looked at me the way she does, direct, a little amused by something she's not going to say out loud, measuring. "Go see to the horses," she said. "Breakfast in 20 minutes. I went to see to the horses. Clara Prentice married her druggist, and as far as I know she's still in Columbus. I hope he's good to her. I don't spend much thought on it. I spent some in the beginning when you turn things over and look at the edges and try to understand the shape of what happened and what didn't happen. But that fell away. What did not fall away was this. The elder sister was meant for him, and the youngest stepped off in her boots. I think about that sometimes, the plain fact of it. That the whole thing turned on a letter being written wrong on an envelope, and a woman deciding that somebody ought to go. That I went to that stage to tie off a loose end, and I came home with a different life than the one I'd arranged. The boots, Clara's boots, the ones Nora wore through that first winter, are in the back of the wardrobe. I found them once when I was looking for something else. Both of them, good leather gone soft with wear, creased and shaped now to a foot they were never made for, the toes packed hard with old cloth. I held one of them for a moment. I asked her why she'd kept them. She thought about it. She stood there and thought about it genuinely, which is how she thinks about most things. "To remember," she said, "that I chose." I put the boot back. I closed the wardrobe. I didn't say anything else. There wasn't anything else to say. A woman who walked through a Wyoming winter in her sister's boots, who told a stranger it was her ranch too, who put her hand in my arm and watched a better offer ride away down the road. She doesn't need me to tell her what she did. She knows what she did. What I know is this. I was not anyone's first choice. I know that. I was the arrangement that the first choice didn't need anymore. I had put that together in words and sent it across the country, and it had come back in the form of a woman I had not been expecting, with a decision already made that I hadn't been part of making, and she had stood in a Wyoming street in October and offered me a life. Some men wait their whole lives for someone to look at them and see something worth staying for. I know those men. I was one of them for a long time. What I know now is that sometimes the woman who sees it isn't who you were expecting. Sometimes she comes after in her sister's boots on a one-way ticket, and she steps down into the dust, and she looks at the street, and she looks at you, and the decision is already done. And all you have to do, The only thing that's ever asked of you is understand it before it's too late. It took me a February snowstorm and a cup of tea and a quiet kitchen to understand it. I'm glad I did.